Fools. It is 2 o'clock here on the East Coast, our usual Millionacres hour. I'm taking things in a different direction today. Not talking directly about real estate, but talking about air conditioning, which, lives inside real estate. So my guest today is Eric Dean Wilson, who's the author of this book, After Cooling. And now you may not have thought much about air conditioning, except for being really grateful it exists. But this book, by the time I was through chapter 1, I was already tweeting him hey, I need to interview you. So thank you so much for joining me, Eric. Oh, there you go.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Well, this book just kind of fascinated me. And one of the things I found most interesting was that in the beginning of air conditioning, there was sort of this resistance to this idea of comfort. And I found that really fascinating considering where we're all at now.
Absolutely. It was one of the most surprising things that I found too, was that we have this assumption that the whole history of civilization was just waiting for air conditioning, and that once it appeared and the technology was available for it, it would have gone wild. And that's not at all what happened. The infrastructure came after a really long and concerted effort on the part of air conditioning engineers and advertisers, convincing people that they actually wanted this. One of the funniest things that happened is that the real start of the history of air conditioning begins in the 1840s, as far back as the 1840s in Florida. And a physician named Dr. John Gorey, who really wanted to help people with malaria. At the time, we have to remember that people didn't understand the connection between mosquitoes and malaria. And also malaria in the deep south in the United States was really, really bad. Hundreds of people would die every season. And so this doctor, Dr. John Gorey, had this brilliant idea to create a cooling machine. Various scientists, British scientists and some American scientists had worked out more or less the basic physics of how mechanical cooling might work. And Dr. Gorey thought these feverish patients could be cooled mechanically and feel better, if not cured. So he did indeed invent the first air conditioner. It was about the size of a small room with a big, what would look like a big car engine. It was probably very noisy. It used water as a refrigerant, and it worked. It also accidentally became the first ice maker because it was left on at night, and there was ice that clogged the pipes. So John Gorey, naturally, like all of us, probably thought he was going to be rich. Here's this new invention. Everybody's going to want one. I'm going to be famous. He spent years traveling up and down the eastern seaboard, trying to find investors. He found one in New Orleans, and the man died before he agreed and signed the paper. Dr. Gorey died a penniless man. Nobody was interested in this contraption. It was too weird. People thought it was unhealthy. And when he died, he had a patent pending for the air conditioning machine, but his wife never sent the patent office the necessary paperwork. So after a few years, the patent office destroyed it. And it wasn't until the early 20th century that the idea of air conditioning really became possible again. And part of that was a improvement in technology, but part of it was also a shift culturally and psychologically. Air conditioning was almost exclusively used before World War I in manufacturing, and it would make things hotter and more humid, as well as cooler and less humid, depending on the product. If you had cotton, for instance, you wanted a pretty humid room so that the strands didn't fray. If you were making movie film, for instance, you wanted it really cool, no humidity. So it really depended on the product. And then after World War I, because the brutalness of the war and the sort of wildness and raucousness of the Roaring '20s, the idea of the kind of comfort and leisure, individual comfort and leisure began very, very slowly to catch on. And it really started with movie theaters.
I like the part in the book about movie theaters because there were a lot of times that the air conditioning kind of didn't work. And you have some funny stories of the book of people, with newspapers because there's dripping and there's all sorts of, it wasn't exactly the pleasant experience that we think of now.
No, and if you think about it, selling air conditioning was a hard sell in the 20s because how do you market something that's totally invisible and that's actually a felt experience and a new one at that? In the early 1920s, air conditioning wasn't unheard of, but a lot of people still hadn't really experienced it firsthand unless they went to the movies. And the way to a good air conditioning engineer understood that great AC meant that when you walked into a place, you should feel so comfortable that you forget about the temperature in the room. But because you forget about the temperature in the room, you're not really cognizant of the air conditioning. That's something that's really hard to sell if you're totally unconscious about the thing that you're trying to sell. So what happened was that air conditioning engineers would often suggest a certain level of temperature, which was a lot higher than what movie theater palace owners would put. They put it so low so that in the summer heat, when you walked in, you had this icy blast of cold air. And it felt amazing for like 2 minutes. And then you sit through an hour and a half, 2 hour long movie in, 55, 60 degree weather, basically a refrigerator. It's not so pleasant anymore. So it became, in the 20s, sorry, there's a helicopter above me. It became this funny notion of like, how do we sell this thing that works best when you notice it least?
Well, I wanted to talk to you about one of the stories in your book about an inventor who I find sort of fascinating. The story is just great about Thomas Midgley, who's kind of called this two-time environmental loser because he's not just involved in air conditioning. He's got another mark against him.
That's right. Thomas Midgley Jr. is really one of the 20th century's wildest and kookiest people. So he is famous for the invention of Freon, and he is also famous for the invention of leaded gasoline. Thus the name two-time environmental loser. He was a quite eccentric man, quite gregarious. He was trained as not a chemical engineer, but a mechanical engineer, which might tell you something a little bit about his inability to see the far-reaching effects of some of his inventions. So he made a lot of money inventing leaded gasoline, which, as we know now, had very bad health effects especially on urban areas. There was a whole controversy around that, even at the time, even before it was out, because in the 20s, there was a lot of research that lead was highly toxic. We've actually known that since ancient Rome. So they tried to disguise it by calling it ethyl gasoline and taking the word tetraethyl lead out. But workers at the plant were dying. And then they sort of pulled a few strings, because when your salary depends upon your not understanding how something is harmful, you kind of ignore a lot of the warning signs. And leaded gasoline wasn't really controversial until really the 60s. And it was finally phased out in the 90s. His second major invention was way less controversial at the time, and that was Freon. And at the time, there was, of course, air conditioning before Freon, and it used a whole bunch of refrigerants that are called natural refrigerants. These are things like ammonia, methyl chloride, things like that. So air conditioning existed before Freon, but the problem with air conditioning is that it was usually the refrigerant was either poisonous or explosive, or sometimes both. So it was always came with some kind of risk. Occasionally you'd have like an ammonia leak in a movie theater, and then suddenly you got the smell of ammonia, which, if you've ever smelled it, is not a great smell. People would go out, throwing up outside the theater. It didn't happen, all the time, but it wasn't so rare that the it caused huge controversy every time it happened. So in the 20s, Frigidaire, which was the cooling division of General Motors, was really looking for a kind of perfect refrigerant, something that was non-corrosive, something that was non-explosive, non-toxic, and something that was relatively cheap to manufacture. And they set Thomas Midgley Jr., because he did such a great job with leaded gasoline, onto the task. And the story goes that he and two research assistants, after being given the task, hit upon dichloro-difluoromethane, soon to be known as Freon, in a matter of hours. And Midgley was this kind of mad genius in the way that we often talk about mad geniuses. He was able to look at a periodic table and, based upon what he knew about the chemical elements, knew that it had to involve fluorine, which is usually incredibly toxic. But he just kind of took a crazy guess that when it was combined with other chemicals, it would suddenly be non-toxic. And he was right. And so, flash forward a couple of years, and Freon became what they started calling a miracle refrigerant. Suddenly, it was the refrigerant. There was no other one really, and variations on the exact chemical that Midgley came up with. The family name is called the CFCs. And they were suddenly in everything that cooled from about the 30s, 40s, 50s on, involved one of the freons in it. And it wasn't really until the 1970s when two scientists, Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina, who just died actually a year or two ago, both of whom won the Nobel Prize for their discovery, found out that Freon, which is so stable chemically, that was one of the reasons that made it such a miracle refrigerant, is that it didn't break down very easily and it didn't react with anything, which normally is great. But they discovered that what happens is when it gets into the upper atmosphere, it's finally broken down by the rays of the sun. And when that happens, it starts to interact with the ozone layer, which is this very thin layer of ozone in the upper atmosphere, which is really the only thing that keeps us from the deadliest rays of the sun. It is, without it, there's no life on Earth that can be possible. So it is really what keeps us alive. They were finding out that this had the potential to completely destroy that. So that was alarming, of course, because suddenly it seemed as if this little bitty shield that was protecting everybody from the sun's radiation could vanish. There was a whole controversy about whether this was true, to what extent it was true. The companies that were manufacturing Freon, again, because they were making a lot of money, refused to really see the potential of the danger. And then in the 80s, a scientist named Joseph Farman, who happened to be working in Antarctica, and measuring ozone levels, which are usually incredibly stable, so stable that his boss kept asking him why he was measuring ozone levels every day if they're so stable. It was like asking if the sun would rise every day. Of course it would. So he was noticing that in between September and October over Antarctica, this giant absence of ozone, soon to be known as the ozone hole, would appear suddenly over the course of 2 months. So there was virtually no ozone over the Antarctic, and then it would close just as quickly as it appeared. And he thought his instruments were acting up because Antarctica is a pretty harsh environment. Surely something was wrong. And as it turned out, it was not wrong. The extreme conditions of cold in the Antarctic were causing this really rapid depletion of ozone in the ozone layer. And that was spreading out to places where there actually were populations of people in Chile. And then quickly a hole appeared at the north, in the Arctic, in the North Pole too. So that was scary and terrible. The good news about that is that it was so extreme And the image of the ozone hole was so scary for people that it actually galvanized action, international regulation pretty quickly. And what came out of that was something called the Montreal Protocol, to prevent substances that deplete the ozone layer. And what that did was put in motion the mechanism that would eventually phase out and then ban the production of Freon. And it took international effort of some of the most industrialized countries in the world, some of whom were making huge profit off of Freon, to finally agree that, yes, this chemical is destroying not just our planet, but it's going to destroy us very, very soon. And to put regulations in place that would stop it. And it is still the only international environmental regulation that's legally binding with its emissions quotas to prevent future environmental disaster. There has never been one since, and it's still the most effective one. So if there's any kind of story of hope out of the history of air conditioning, it's really that, you know, we've done this once, the whole planet worked together to do this, and we can do it again, I think.
Well, one aspect of this that you mentioned in the book that I think is important too is the racial aspect around this. And part of the reason that people acted so quickly was because white males were more apt to get skin cancer, or more apt to, be the ones who would benefit the most by this, by fixing this problem, essentially.
Absolutely. And the racial aspect of it, as you said, it runs through the whole history of air conditioning from the very beginning to that, which was something that I was completely surprised about at first. But then once I started thinking about it, I thought, oh, of course, this makes sense. And one of the things, before even get to the ozone layer, one of the things that was surprising to me to find out was the post-war housing boom. Had a very disturbing racist aspect to it, which is that the Federal Housing Administration, which had been created in the 1930s to make it more possible for Americans to own homes, had what was called an underwriting manual, which was not something that was officially published, but was circulated within the company. And the historian Richard Rothstein has a great book on this called The Color of Law. Yeah,
I love that. That's a great read.
It's such a great read. I feel like it should be necessary reading for everybody, especially in real estate. And it tells a very disturbing history of how, explicitly in the underwriting manual, it said that these new loans that were possible after World War II, that had all these great things with them. I had written this down because I couldn't remember it. They ensuring bank mortgages that covered 80% of purchase prices, had terms of 20 years, and were fully amortized. They explicitly said no loans to Black developments or Black homeowners. This Federal Housing Administration underwriting manual was adopted full sail in the GI Bill that came later and was really important to the housing boom that followed. So essentially, all of these benefits and all of these legs up from the government were given exclusively to white homeowners or white aspiring homeowners. And as a friend just pointed out to me recently, it wasn't just Black Americans that were excluded. It was also often Jewish Americans too. So basically anyone that wasn't white, or seen as white at the time. And this has ramifications, of course, generational ramifications. Something that I just found out the other day is that just a few months ago, the city of Evanston, Illinois, I don't know if you heard about this, but they just moved to enact racial reparations. And they're the very first city in the United States to do that. And the way that they chose to manifest those racial reparations was through access to housing because of the redlining that had happened in the city of Evanston from the 20s to the 60s. So that is really the first community in the United States that's fully acknowledged the damage and the intergenerational damage that this kind of redlining happened. And the way that air conditioning is connected to this, it might seem like this is not connected, but the way that it's connected is that the housing boom kind of really made air conditioning in the home for a couple of reasons. For one thing, by 1957, all this quick housing was being put up, and it was a kind of modernist housing, so the sort of boxy housing that we think of now, and it really required air conditioning. The reason for that is that if you didn't have it, it was so sealed up that you would basically like suffocate without air conditioning. So they were making in my view, a kind of bad design that required air conditioning and ignored the outdoor environment. And they began in the late 1950s to include installing AC in mortgages for houses. And again, only to white families. So it was very common for white families to have central AC. It was not very common for non-white families to have central AC or AC at all, really. And then over the decades that followed, the racial gap closed a little bit, but never really fully closed. There's still a discrepancy between white homeowners and black homeowners and who has air conditioning and who doesn't. And the other aspect of it is that in part of the advertising campaign to convince people that they wanted and needed air conditioning in the homes, in some cases, this was a true need because of the bad building design. In other cases, it was not a true need. It was just, a typical company convincing you, oh, you don't have air conditioning, don't you want it? It's very enticing. And what they did, Carrier was one of the main people who did this, but there were other companies. The ads in the 50s were highly racialized. They used stereotypes of individuals who were from Africa or Mexico and painted them as lazy workers because of the heat, and then showed a sweating white businessman and said that air conditioning will help him work in the workplace and get further ahead in the economy. So they really preyed upon people's racial fears and also the work cultures that were in place to try to sell air conditioning. Fast forwarding, this racialized aspect, what you had mentioned about the ozone hole is, something I was thinking about while writing this book is necessarily speculative, but and I'm clear about that in the book, but I also feel that it's definitely a factor in solving the ozone crisis. And that is the fact that, as I said, the ozone layer is what allows life. Without it, there would be crop failures, food chains in the ocean would totally collapse. So there's all these horrible things that happen. But with just a little bit of ozone depletion, the immediate effect is increased radiation that would lead to skin cancer. And I want to be clear that everyone could get skin cancer regardless of skin color, but it is far more common for people with lighter skin color to get skin cancer. It's like something like 20 to 30 times more likely. And the interesting thing is that even though there were these greater planetary collapses, the media, the US media and the kind of media of the industrialized world really focused on skin cancer. And there might be a couple reasons for that. One is it's more immediate, it's more personal. It's really hard to relate to global food collapse because it's just such a big and scary idea. But the skin cancer was easier to kind of communicate directly. And the consequences of that is that the whole discourse on the news was about skin cancer and the fear of that, which is to say that it was a fear that was particularly acute for white people. And so one of the things I ask in the book is it's so great that we solved this crisis, and the Montreal Protocol is so great, but is one of the reasons why it was such a successful campaign is because it appeared to target first and foremost white people. And I flipped that question around and asked, would we have had the same success if it only targeted dark-skinned people or black people? And I don't know that it would have, for a whole bunch of reasons. So, that's one of the more provocative questions that I explore in the book. And I also think it's one that we can learn from as we try to think about and address the climate crisis.
I think it is one of the important things in the book. And I think the other thing that I found really interesting in the book was sort of the division between the carbon guys and the other guys involved in buying up Freon. So the interesting thing I found in this book is there's this whole shadow. I love shadow economies in general, and there's this whole shadow economy about buying up Freon. And it's really fascinating. You went out on the road with a friend and bought Freon, and there were some interesting situations there. So tell us a good story about that, because there are a lot of them in the book. Absolutely.
So the way that I really got into this is through my friend Sam, and Sam, he has a different job now, but he was working for a green energy startup, and they were looking for various sustainable energy projects that would make money. They tried wind farms, that didn't work. And then bizarrely, they landed on Freon. So it's illegal to produce Freon, but it's perfectly legal to buy and sell Freon on the secondary market. And you can, through California's cap and trade system, you can, if you destroy Freon anywhere in the continental United States, and you're certified to do so, you can get what's called carbon offset credits, which prove that a certain amount of pollution is destroyed, which allows big companies in California that are regulated under the state to pollute in just that amount more. Usually it's capped, but if you pollute, say, like 5 pounds in Iowa, and you prove that you've done that, then the company that buys those offset credits from you can pollute 5 pounds more than the regulated limit. And so by buying those, which is, if it sounds problematic, it is. But if you buy credits, then the person selling them obviously gets money. So Sam and his partner were wondering, could we actually make money off of destroying this? Although the offset market and cap and trade is problematic in all these ways, what's interesting is that for a finite resource that's not produced anymore, which Freon is, it does work to tangibly destroy this material that you're not producing any more of. So although it creates a market for destroying the pollution, which is to say it creates a market for the pollution, if you're not producing the pollution, it actually can work. And there's really one chemical that they found would work for this, and this is Freon, a specific kind of Freon, CFC12. So they found, actually, to their surprise, that the United States was loaded with Freon. And why is still a little bit of a mystery. Lots of people, way more people than the government expected, stockpiled this. And what's interesting is that in what Sam told me was that in talking with these people why they had it, there were all kinds of reasons, but a main one was actually a reason that a lot of environmentalists would see as familiar, which is that they didn't want to be wasteful. They felt that destroying it, that it was a perfectly good chemical. It sometimes didn't understand, or most of the time didn't believe that it was actually harmful to the planet. So they would say, like, why would I destroy this perfectly useful tool? It's just wasteful. Why not sell it and continue to use it? And so there's actually an interesting sort of conservation ethic behind that, even though it doesn't really take into account the planetary effects of it. And so after talking with Sam a lot about this, I said, I'd really like to see you interact with some of these people. The interesting thing is that Sam was incredibly eco-conscious and trying to reconcile business with his environmental ethics. And most of the people he bought the Freon from were not. They were often very suspicious of people who identified as environmental. Sometimes they were global warming deniers. Sometimes they found out what Sam was doing with the Freon, destroying it for carbon credits, calling him, as you said, a carbon guy, and would say, "I don't want to do business with you." So there was a divide between people who would use it and then people who would destroy it for carbon credits. And in some cases, if Sam was able to establish a good business relationship first, he was able to have honest conversations with some of these people. And one of the most touching stories that he told me that's in the book was with this reclaimer who went by the name of the Iceman. And he was known throughout the Midwest as having hundreds of thousands of pounds of Freon and other refrigerants. And he was just kind of this like savant about getting this used refrigerant. And he was also this kind of gruff Midwestern macho guy. And the very first time that Sam showed up on his property to buy the Freon, he connected him, I think, through Craigslist, some kind of online thing. And he showed up, and the Iceman, just kind of like sussing out his polo shirt and nice jeans, he said, "Are you a carbon guy? Are you going to destroy this?" And Sam was honest, and he said, "Yeah, I am." And he said, "Get off my property." And Sam decided to kind of push back and say, "I will, I understand, but I drove 4 hours out of here, which is a waste of time for me and also for you. And we're both dealing with this material." And he said, "Honestly, if you sell it to some of the bigger guys, they're going to tell you one thing, and they're probably going to destroy it for carbon credits too, because it's a market that is making so much money that really everybody's doing this." And they kind of leveled and had a conversation. And the Iceman said, "Well, okay, I guess we're both business people. It doesn't really matter to me what you do with it." And the funny thing is that over several months, their business relationship turned into a friendship, and a friendship across a deep political divide. And to the point where this man, who had previously not really thought about the environment, thought people who are interested in the environment were elitist, were not interested in people, they were interested in the planet, things like that, began to understand that actually it was more complicated than that. And once he understood that it was about the next generation, he had 2 children, then he really, really began to agree. "Oh, I understand. It's actually for my children. This is why you're doing this. For the next generation, it's for kids. It's also for us in the present, but it's about making life possible, continuing to make life possible." So this to me was such a remarkable story, in an era where we're used to hearing almost as a cliche that Americans are more divided than ever. Here was a story about 2 people across vastly different political divides able to first establish a business relationship, and then through that have really tough conversations about the future, about business, about climate change. And they sort of reached a point where they were able to talk about this, and Sam was able to change his mind just a little bit. And I find that remarkable. And, not to say that we should all strive to go coerce each other into believing our own political beliefs, but that with, a lot of time and patience and care and honest conversations, and also willingness to be wrong, then our opinions can shift radically. And the very last moment in the book explores how the Iceman became very ill with cancer, and said that he was given just a few weeks to live. And as one of his last gestures, he left his entire Freon stock to Sam to destroy. And it's really such a beautiful and touching story.
It definitely is. But he did leave some of the other chemicals for other guys, right? I think that that was at the end of the book that he also that it,
Totally.
yeah.
That's
So
right.
interesting
Yeah.
point to mention too. But yeah,
Yeah.
I loved that conversation in the book. The idea of the sort of that cliche of the coastal elites and their their agenda, and the people who are in a more rural area being like, we're just trying to get along in the world. There is that. It's a cliche, but it's also something that I think still exists, and it's something we're all going to have to figure out because, I mean, this summer, what an example of the need for air conditioning. It has already been incredibly hot. Most of us are putting on the air conditioning without thinking about it. Some of the office buildings where there aren't even people in them are being, kept really cold. And you talk a lot in the book about our comfort levels and how our comfort levels have shifted. And I thought that was really interesting. One of the things you mentioned in the book was, I think it was a quote from a scientist from Botswana who was saying that uh, people in the US will have a more difficult time adjusting to a different comfort level if we need to than in other places where they're more used to not having, walking by a store and you get that blast of cold air.
Absolutely. And that was such a shock for me to hear that, to hear her say that. And all evidence points to that being the case. So a couple points about that is that we have a really hard time, especially in the United States, distinguishing between danger and discomfort. And I want to be clear that the heat wave that's been glowering over the Pacific Northwest has been incredibly dangerous.
Yes.
That's an instance in which if people don't have air conditioning, they can die or don't have access to cooling. So I want to sort of table that because I'm afraid that sometimes when I'm talking about this, people immediately jump to the most extreme example, which is that, and think that I'm saying that those people shouldn't have air conditioning, which is not true. I don't think that. I think that everyone should have access to life-saving cooling. But what's interesting is that we have a hard time distinguishing between discomfort and danger. One of the things that's emerging in a lot of peer-reviewed research is that when you are that air conditioning can actually make us more vulnerable to heat waves. The body acclimatizes, and anybody can acclimatize over a period of 3 to 4 weeks. They did a study with a high school football team where they had one football team practice gradually in a very controlled environment in increasingly hot and humid conditions, and nobody had a heat-related illness. They had another group where they were vacillating between highly air-conditioned and very hot conditions, so not acclimatized at all, and just thrust them out in a game when it was 80, 90 degrees. And they had, unfortunately, a couple players who ended up in the hospital for a heat-related illness. So what happens in that moment is that over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, it's an evolutionary adaptation, is that the body can acclimatize a little bit. And again, to be clear, there's a limit. We can't acclimatize to like 110 degrees. But when you're spending all day in an office that's air conditioned in 65-degree weather and it's 90 degrees outside, you're actually more vulnerable to the heat stress than you would be if you were if your body was acclimatized. So that's one thing. I had another point that just left me. The other thing is that a lot of the buildings that there's a sort of feedback loop that happens, which is that in the early 20th century, they did all this research on what makes somebody most comfortable. And then they came up with a kind of standard for that. And then all the buildings were built to that standard. But the irony is that once you get used to that standard, you actually become used to when you don't have that standard, and when that standard breaks, you become incredibly uncomfortable. And it's not because you're naturally uncomfortable, it's because you're used to the standard that was set by somebody decades ago. And so our level of comfort is remarkably wider than we actually think it to be. So part of what I'm trying to do in this book and ask in this book is that, yes, we need cooling in certain extreme situations, but we also need to widen our definition of comfort. And I'm not asking anybody to just suffer through these things, but I'm actually, as somebody who's done this and also talked to a lot of people from places who don't have air conditioning, like Ecuador or El Salvador, or people who grew up in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of those places, they grew up in very, very hot conditions without air conditioning. And invariably, I hear people say, yeah, I grew up in Ecuador in 90-degree weather, humidity, and it was hot, but it was fine. And you kind of get used to it, and you learn how to cool yourself without using technology. The other thing, the last thing I remembered was going to say is that that it's worth looking at why people die in heat waves, which is very, very interesting. And one of the things that this is what kind of sociologists can tell us. And I look at the work of a really brilliant sociologist named Eric Klinenberg, who I believe teaches at NYU, but he wrote this book called Heat Wave. And he found that there was a heat wave in Chicago in 1955 that killed a certain amount of people. It was brutal. It was very bad. And there was a heat wave 40 years later in 1995. Very similar conditions. And despite there, in that time span, being way more air conditioning, twice as many people died in the 1995 heat wave. So this book asks, why is that? If there was more cooling, why did more people die? And he found out that the reason why, and not everyone, but the reason why people actually die or end up in the hospital in a heat wave has less to do with access to cooling than it does to things like access to community support, access to shade in neighborhoods. The places that were hottest had no trees, no parks, asphalt everywhere, which makes the surroundings like at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. The people that were most vulnerable were often elderly men who were too stubborn to go to a cooling center, for instance. They were also often depressed or drinking a lot, which of course dehydrates the body. So there were other problems that were happening. Yes, the heat was important, but it was actually, there's community infrastructure that we need to look at also, and it's actually crucial. And of course, there's the irony that during a heat wave, what tends to happen? You have blackouts. So even if you have air conditioning, the very tool that's supposed to cool you, you might not be able to afford the electricity. And even if you can, then during the heat wave, everybody's using it. And what happens is it puts stress on the grid, and the heat wave, or the electrical grid goes out. So now you don't have this tool that was supposed to save you. So what's amazing to me about Klinenberg is that he really challenged us to look at the problem ecologically in terms of the community. Do our neighborhoods have what they need to survive the heat wave? Are we acting like this is an emergency? When we're all supposed to get inside and turn on the air conditioner and just every man for himself, to me, that's not really acting like it's an emergency. The whole city needs to mobilize like it would in a hurricane. And when we're left to our own devices, the people who have access to air conditioning, either because they're in a better neighborhood or because they can afford the electricity, are fine. And the people who don't have access to that are just left on their own, and sometimes they die. And that's horrible. And so part of what I think we need to really come to terms with is understanding how individual comfort is a very limiting idea about comfort, and that we actually can think about neighborhood and even municipal health rather than every man for himself, because we're all connected. And actually, when you save the neighborhood and when you make the whole neighborhood better, it's actually an act of self-preservation.
What do you think about the fact that we're in the middle of this Sunbelt migration? We've got so many people moving to Phoenix. Phoenix is growing by leaps and bounds. There's home builders are kind of, centering in those areas. People are moving to Austin in droves. There's so many people moving to the areas that are going to be the hottest. And it seems like that's already putting more stress on the power grids and things like that. So is that something else that you're concerned about?
Absolutely. And it's such a great question. I don't know that I have a really satisfying answer, but a couple of things come to mind. One of them is that certainly the need for renewable energy in all aspects. And I don't want to downplay that. That's super important. Transforming our infrastructure, which is, in all the things that I've read, also a pro-jobs, pro-business move. If not, both in the short term and the long term. So we have to do that. But my mind keeps going back, and you're right. Phoenix actually can't exist as a city year round without air conditioning. It's, the air conditioning capital of the world. And it's the extreme version. And the question I have, which I really truly mean as a question, I don't mean it as a provocative leading answer, is should we be living there year round? And is it really truly sustainable over a long period, a century, say, 2 centuries, 3 centuries? Will people still be able to live there? And I'm thinking that far ahead because we need to. We're so used to thinking in terms of one generation over one lifespan, but that's gotten into a lot of trouble. Can we really healthfully be there in a healthy way? And I'm not sure that the answer is yes. And so that is really scary because people live there and they don't want to uproot their lives, and it's certainly not their fault. And I think that it's the result of bad leadership and bad assumptions that are made in terms of what technology can do and can't do. I think of an idea that's related to coastal sea rise around this similar idea, which is called managed retreat, which is over the course of several decades, thinking about, okay, what do we do with, say, New York City or, Boston or something like that? You have millions of people here. Do you build a seawall? Do you move people, entice people to move away from that? And there's all these kinds of thinkers and policymakers who are working on this right now, and sort of under the loose heading of managed retreat. And I think we have to seriously consider whether managed retreat might be a concept for these desert climates. And there's all other issues too, like water, access to water, things like that. So, that's a really scary prospect for people. But we also have to think about whether it's safe to live in these areas that are, in some cases, on fire, and whether that is actually a sound investment or not.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of questions coming in. One of them is, are there any good resources on the natural hole in the ozone layer that you mentioned that appeared above Antarctica?
Yeah, well, there is a great book by Seth Kagan and Philip Dray called I'm blanking on it right now, but I can find the answer real quickly while I'm talking. And unfortunately, it's out of print, but you might be able to check it out in a library. And it's the whole story of what's called the Ozone War. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to tell the story in the book, and the story is also in After Cooling, so you could check that out too, is that a lot of these histories are out of print or hard to find. So the story's been told before, especially for an older generation, but people who are younger didn't grow up with the story because it's sort of a story that had completed. We solved the ozone crisis, case closed, and we're not used to hearing the story anymore. But strangely, there's not, I think this is the only book that's really told that story recently. Also, the Nathaniel Rich book that came out, I'm having trouble with titles right now, but it's his previous book, is a new book about essays called Second Nature that's out right now, but his previous book about the Earth also covers a little bit about the ozone crisis. It's actually about global warming when we first discovered it, but the two are connected.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question is from Lisa, who was wondering if there are any environmentally friendly solutions for cooling spaces on the horizon.
Definitely. I am told that heat pumps are a pretty good alternative to air conditioners, and you can, if you just kind of Google heat pumps, you can read about how they work. They're kind of like air conditioners in reverse, and they use way less energy. There's a whole new generation of refrigerants called HFOs that look very promising and are starting to be used in design in Europe and even in the United States. And they're not global warming gases, and they don't deplete the ozone layer. We're, funny enough, going back to some of those natural refrigerants that are either poisonous or explode. But the difference is that they're better able to be contained, and the technology that's using them is a bit better. So I imagine that they're way, way, way safer than they were in the 1920s. But yeah, a lot of vending machines, for instance, Coca-Cola made headlines for switching the global warming refrigerants to carbon dioxide, which could be used as a refrigerant. It's not the ideal miracle refrigerant that Freon was, but then again, Freon just almost destroyed the ozone layer. So wasn't quite as ideal as we thought it was. So it's funny, there's sort of two directions: new chemicals that are a little bit more friendly, although they still require energy, which produces emissions, and then going back to the early 20th century refrigerants.
Well, before we wrap up, I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned in the beginning about the industrial uses of cooling. There's a few that I'm thinking of right now. One of them is cold storage, obviously growing by leaps and bounds. The other one I've really been thinking about a lot lately is data centers, because especially during the pandemic, we keep using more and more data. Well, where are the cloud? The cloud is in these big, giant buildings that all need to be cooled because they're all very, very hot. Is there any solution to those types of situations that's kind of out in the offing?
Yeah, and that's such a great question, because we often trick ourselves into thinking that the internet is not a material place, but
Yes.
it actually is. It's a material place. There are warehouses, as you said. It's a fantastic question. I'm not an expert in this, but I did think about having a section in the book about this, and then I started working on it and ended up taking it out. The good thing about data centers is that it's very tricky to cool people. It's way less tricky to cool computers because they don't complain. So there's a couple of things that come to mind. I know that there are some data centers. I think that Google, maybe not in all of them, but in a lot of their data centers, they cool through water, cold water. Mm-hmm. So where the data centers are is a huge factor. If you can put them in naturally cold places and use the surrounding environment like a lot of the Google data centers do, that's fantastic. You're not using any extra energy. You can take cold water, and it doesn't have to be potable water. It just has to be cold water. It could be seawater, for instance. And you can use that. Again, you don't have to cool people, so you just have to cool the actual center. The other thing is that we sometimes get fixed on the idea of cooling whole spaces and instead of the actual things that need to be cooled. Better cooling center design where only the processors are cooled, but maybe the rest of it isn't, could help a lot. But you're right, it's a huge problem. And something like, for instance, Bitcoin, the cooling of data centers for Bitcoin generates an enormous amount of global warming emissions. And that's a huge problem. And we really need more work and more studies on how to keep this cooling infrastructure more sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the book, you talk a little bit about, and we talked about this a little bit, but your own experience with, acclimating yourself. You've said that you're, don't use air conditioning that much. Is that something we should all be doing? Should we all be sort of experimenting with our own comfort level?
I would say yes. I mean, in conditions that are certainly not dangerous, that's for sure. But I was surprised. I grew up in the South. I think when a lot of people hear what my book is about, they assume, oh, you must not have grown up in the South. Well, I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, where it was regularly in the 90s, 100% humidity. And I love air conditioning. I loved it. And when I started working on this, part of what I wanted to do, and of course I moved, I live in Brooklyn now, so I'm not in the deep South, and that's very different, and it makes a difference. But even when I moved to New York, for instance, I carried with me the same level of comfort and the same expectations of the thermal environment. So I remember when I first moved, there was a summer that it was in the mid 80s maybe, and I was living in this apartment and I didn't have air conditioning, and I survived maybe like 2 hours, and then went out and bought one, and I couldn't bear it because I just thought it was ridiculous. And after sort of experimenting with it and acclimatizing myself, I realized that, oh, actually with strategically placed fans, cold showers, hydrating a lot, also lowering expectations for productivity, which I know that not everyone has the capacity to do. But a lot of what the problem is that we assume that we can keep going at the productivity level. We can keep working at the exact same rate all year round. And that assumption is a very contemporary assumption. And what I'm sort of challenging us all to do is to challenge that assumption in ways that, large and small. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody has the flexibility to do that. But I think that, we've touched on this just a little bit, but one of the things that makes air conditioning and cooling in general so tricky is that it's so closely related to work cultures. And I think that underlying the energy crisis is really certain assumptions about work and labor. And I think that one of the interesting things about studying air conditioning is that you can actually get to the labor issue or the work issue, the economic issue through this idea of air conditioning. So all to say that I was deeply surprised at how my level of comfort shifted. And I haven't used air conditioning since I used it for 2 days in 2019. I haven't used it at all here. And we've had some mid 90 to high 90 degree days. And I had to adjust my expectations and use a hand fan, which is quite fashionable as an accessory. And, you wear less items of clothing and things like that. But to expect that we could just continue like we are in 65 degree environments seems a little bit ridiculous to me. And dare I say, it's kind of fun too, not having air conditioning, because you get to experience the outdoors a little closer. You're not sort of insulated in this sort of sensory deprivation chamber of a air conditioned room.
Well, I've been thinking about that too, because I've been thinking about work from home is that all of us, our relationship with our air conditioning has probably changed because working in the office, everyone just brings in a sweater because it's going to be cold in the summer. But if you're working from home, you've got control over things. So I think that maybe, hopefully, is changing people's relationship with air conditioning. And I think you mentioned a really good point earlier, which is that idea that how it's harder to cool people. But I've seen some architects start to be more cognizant of how to use shade, how to have buildings that have automatic sensors and things like that sort of close windows. And because I feel like the past used to be you'd have these big giant office buildings, all glass, just heat pouring in and air conditioning trying to combat that. We seem to be getting a little smarter there.
Absolutely. And this is the hope that I have in good design, is that we really need good designers to lead the way. And there have been big office buildings that have just pretended that the that the given environment doesn't exist. And I don't think we can continue like that. We have to work with the hyper local climatic conditions that we're given. And that could be that's a great thing. It's a limitation that I think leads to a lot of creativity. I mentioned in the book, one of the best examples of this is the architect Zaha Hadid, who's passed away a couple of years ago. And she, in the middle of the desert in Saudi Arabia, she created the Petroleum Studies Institute. And it uses a little bit of air conditioning, but not really. It has these hive-like structures that catch the wind that tend to come from one side, and it reroutes the wind into these open air courtyards. And it keeps the direct sunlight out, and it keeps the space of the building incredibly cool with just minimal electricity in the middle of the desert because of good design. And she designed that by looking at nature, certain hive-like structures in like termites, which can build these incredible structures that have different chambers that are kept at really specific temperatures. So I think that we can actually learn from animals who build these complex architectures that have climate controlled spaces, obviously without air conditioning. And the best designers, I think, are doing that today.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was amazing. I'm really glad that I reached out to you on Twitter. For listeners, the book is After Cooling. We will put a link in the resources. And thanks again.
Thank you very much for having me. Have a great day.
All right, you too.